Welcome to this episode of Cyber Exchange's Innovator Spotlight. I am Armstead Whitney, the CEO of Aptega, and really excited today to talk about a topic that is just really any company that is building a cybersecurity program needs to address, and it's vendor management. Everything you read in the news these days around a lot of incidents and breaches, many of those are happening due to the third-party supply chain. And case in point, we saw what happened in SolarWinds earlier this year. So vendor management is critical to every great security program. And really excited here to introduce the CEO of one of the leading providers of vendor management, Nick Sorensen. Nick, welcome to today's broadcast.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Well, let's jump right in. I think for those of us that want to get a little bit of a primer on vendor management. So Nick, if you had to describe vendor management, what is vendor management?
Yeah, I think one way to think about this is getting a handle on all of those third parties that have access to your information that you use to run your business. And so for certain types of companies, this could be suppliers that deliver goods and services. For the technology industry, this is mainly information. So vendors you use to run a portion of your business that you exchange information with. And so broadly speaking, getting a handle on that, there's a subset of that would be vendor risk management, sort of measuring, assessing, analyzing, and mitigating the risks involved in your vendor base. But that's kind of the topic for discussion today.
And there's a lot of threats out there that test every company's resiliency. Are there any specific threats in general that your customers or you're seeing in the market that vendor management can really address?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges from an industry perspective that we see consistently is that most companies in the world today don't have a proactive approach to this. They're not thinking about vendor management or managing these risks. They're letting it happen to them. And so still the majority of companies don't have this dialed in their organization. And so I would say from an industry perspective, the awareness and need to do this is one of the biggest challenges we face today. Now we're being helped by some of the news that we read, some of the incidents that are happening, some of the regulatory tailwinds that are pushing organizations to have to do this more and more. But in a lot of ways, this is something that is a theme that's not going to go away in the future, that more and more companies are having to pay attention to.
So let's say a threat actor or a nation state is trying to steal information or IP or get some financial gain by hacking into, let's say, a large enterprise. Is it your feeling that a lot of the larger enterprises themselves have pretty decent security because they have the budgets and the teams? And does vendor management address that area where the threat actor may say, well, hey, I can't maybe break into that large enterprise directly, but I'll bet they've got a supply chain that's more vulnerable. How does that play into it?
Certainly don't pretend to have a pulse on all of the security postures of all the enterprises throughout the world, but in our experience, it's all over the map. There's a wide variety of situations, and a lot of that has to do with the industry and the scrutiny and the regulation that's put on those organizations. Some of it has to do with the culture of the company. Right. I would say in general, certainly one of the first things you look at from a security perspective is your own defense. And third party comes later. When I think about protecting my organization, I don't think first of my third party vendors that have a tie into my organization. So we see an evolution. Companies got to tackle first things first. And as they mature and grow their program and get more advanced, they start to look at where else do we have exposure? What are the other areas? And certainly third party vendors are a potential risk area that they start to address as they evolve in their maturity.
You mentioned compliance. I'm assuming you're referring to frameworks like SOC 2, PCI, NIST that all have requirements for some type of vendor management program. Do most of the compliance frameworks have that requirement?
Many of them do, and we're seeing more and more of these frameworks come out that have requirements in that. So that is a key driver for a lot of organizations. You have kind of external regulatory framework pressure that might be, in healthcare, a HIPAA. If you're doing business in Europe, that might be GDPR. Those types of regulations. You may have more kind of customer driven, which might be a SOC 2 type 2 audit that your customers are asking you to take care of, and that has a component of vendor management along with it as well. And so you have a number of things that are driving that in the industry. Certainly one of the bigger ones is that regulatory and audit component.
Yeah, we talk to a lot of CIOs and CISOs all across the country, and many of them get these questionnaires from potential customers that want to do business with them. Some of them, could be up to 250 questions. Banks are kind of known for very large questionnaires. It seems like, do you see vendor management also showing up in those customer questionnaires?
Yeah, that's a key. That's sort of the most common experience that organizations have with vendor risk management, is this exchange of information. Majority of the time, as you mentioned, in a spreadsheet or in an email. That's still how the vast majority of this vendor risk management exercise happens today. We're obviously going to talk about how we help automate and address that for both the organization doing the assessment, but as well as third-party vendors. It's a huge burden if you're a third-party vendor and you're trying to sell, and you get those 300 questions at the end of the sales process, right? And it's going to take your internal team days or weeks to turn that around. And so, in a lot of ways, that process itself is where most of the time is spent. We need a lot more transparency in the industry so that we don't waste the time on getting information. We need to spend that time diving into the actual security and compliance of the vendors that we do business with.
It seems vendor management is one of those areas of security that gets the attention of the head of sales of a company, their CEO and the board, when they get that questionnaire and they've got to sort of hustle and try to figure out what they're going to do to answer the questions, or they need to be compliant to the vendor management areas. Because if that customer is doing that due diligence and they don't get a good report, then they may take their business elsewhere. Is that a big driver as well, that you're not just something that's touched by security people, but also it impacts sales, I would think?
Yeah, for sure. The sales team is the recipient of the vendor management program of their customer, right? They're on the flip side of that coin, and you're exactly right. In a lot of organizations, this is slowing down and locking up revenue.
Yep.
A lot of companies that are forward thinking are thinking of that as a competitive advantage, because they know their competition is slower or not as transparent or not as not as forthcoming with their security compliance program. Maybe they don't have their ducks in a row on that front. And we see forward-thinking companies using that as a competitive advantage and bringing that up early on in the sales process and sort of leading with that, instead of hiding from it, which was the thing in the past. You used to try to dodge these exercises. As more and more companies realize that this isn't going away and this is just the beginning, they've got to address it head on. And that's sort of the environment that we're in right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because that switches the importance from security being an operational type of thing, internally to impacting top line growth. So it's just another great driver on the importance of it. You mentioned people use spreadsheets for vendor management today. One question I have is, how far down in the supply chain do you think an organization should go, as far as understanding the risk? Is there a tiered approach that people should be thinking about, which is, just starting with cloud and security providers? Does it go all the way down even into my building I'm in? And what do you tell the market around sort of where to focus?
Yeah, the recommendations that we provide are sort of the best practices that are out there, vary based on the industry and the type of company. But in general, one of the interesting things about the industry as a whole is that most companies don't even have a handle on who has access to their data. And so in a lot of ways, let's start at the fundamentals, blocking and tackling. Let's get a handle on that. That's not an easy task. And so in a lot of cases, it's starting with basic information gathering. Who has access to information? How critical is that vendor to my business operations, and how critical or sensitive is that information that they're touching? Is this publicly available information? If this system goes down, are my customers going to be impacted, or is nobody going to notice? And so that's an exercise of triaging the risk and working your way through that. For the more mature organizations, this certainly should encompass all of the third-party vendors in the ecosystem. For most companies, what that looks like initially is the highest risk. You kind of match that matrix up, sensitivity of the data, criticality of the business from an operational perspective to my organization, and you line those pieces up, and from there you can even extend that into the third party vendors of your third party vendors, so the fourth party, right? Because a SaaS vendor that you contract with, it's important to understand who they rely upon to perform their services as well.
There's a lot of change going on in technology. The cloudification, the SaaSification. The global pandemic has created a shift in teleworking, which opens up more risk. And are you seeing this explosion of customers using more cloud and more apps? Does that create more third-party risk if you don't have a central system or central process to manage all of that?
It does. One way to think of this is with the acceleration, that digital transformation that we read about in the news. It's been accelerated by 2 years, or whatever. The industry experts talk about how fast and how rapidly that's been accelerated due to this remote work. That just means my data is in different places now. It's in more places in most cases.
Yeah.
That there's been business benefits to that, right? And we all want those business benefits. There's also risks to that, and that's the other side of it that we need to get a better handle on. In some ways, the remote work environment has further broken the manual processes of many companies related to vendor management, because you're not in the same office. You're not sitting next to that person that you used to collaborate with. And so a lot of those challenges that are just general, inherent with remote work, have been exacerbated from a vendor management perspective, and the need for more centralization of data and process and workflow and automation has come to a head during this last year.
Yeah, it's harder to walk the halls and survey, your executives on their apps they're using, and certainly needs to be some, automation there as well. A lot of people joining us today, might be mid-sized to smaller enterprises where vendor management's critical, but they don't have a lot of staff. How should they approach it? And a lot of people joining us don't even have CISOs, right? And maybe they even use an MSP or MSSP for their infrastructure, which is a big growing trend. How can an organization that's just very thinly staffed and really little knowledge around security approach vendor management?
We see the same playbook working in larger enterprises with resource constrained teams as in smaller organizations as well. And really you've got to take a strategic approach to this part of your business. Most companies are trying to play catch up all the time.
Right.
So it's sort of reacting to somebody wants to buy something. I got to do an assessment. It's usually the day before the contract needs to be signed. I'm the last person. I'm the blocker, and people are yelling at me because I'm slowing it down. That whole thing wears people out, and that's why people hate this aspect of their jobs in a lot of cases, because they're seen as the one that slows things down. So fundamentally, just taking a more strategic approach to that is one of the best things that you can do, and sort of getting buy-in from the management level that this is a thing that we need to do, and let's go do it in the right way. And we see a lot of companies doing this the smart way, which is not trying to boil the ocean. Let's come up with a process and a workflow and a program that meets our needs today and that can scale with us in the future. And then let's look at what parts of that process we can automate with technology and other things internally, so that we can enable the business, secure the business, but not slow down the business.
Right. And just getting started, right? Sounds like the big message. I like to ask all of our guests this question, and then we're going to get into a quick demo of Whistic, or kind of understanding of your platform. But you've been in the industry for several years. You've seen it kind of emerge and grow. Where do you really see vendor management in 5 years? Maybe what are some of the technologies? There's AI and machine learning that's now kind of infiltrated a lot of the stack of technology within the enterprise. Where do you see vendor management kind of falling into that in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so a couple of interesting trends. Still, the majority of companies aren't even paying attention to this at the level that they are. And so there's a lot of room for growth as an industry as more companies come on board with this concept. That wave of vendor risk assessments that are going to go hit vendors is going to cause further pain in the industry. And so one of the biggest trends or predictions that we see on that is that more and more companies are going to realize that this archaic way of just answering questions that get sent to me and sort of waiting for the customer to give me a question and I give them an answer is going to further break. And the need for more transparency and anticipation of what companies really care about from a security perspective is one of the trends that we see. We want to be in the middle of that. We're helping to enable that. But recent study by McKinsey and Company talked about a survey of cybersecurity leaders who are on the manage your vendor side of the house. They asked them, when you're looking at and evaluating SaaS vendors, what's the top thing that helps you feel good about them? I can't remember exactly what the question, but essentially it was that speaks to their security. 70% of them cited transparency. So this greater need for more transparency, more ability to communicate the true nature of things. And I've talked to plenty of information security leaders about the same concept, which is they would much rather know that you're an insecure vendor and the areas of risk that you have than have you sort of dodge that question. It's okay. We can work on it together in that community approach, as opposed to this negotiation, this standoff, which is sometimes what happens. I think that's going to be one of the biggest changes over the next 5 years that we're going to see. It's going to be table stakes to have that transparency.
And I love what you said earlier, the conversation around, lead with security. Don't make it the last thing that's discussed. And in fact, just the fact that a company can lead with security in those customer conversations, those partner conversations, those board conversations, means that culturally, you take it seriously and use it as a competitive advantage. So I think that plays into exactly what you were just talking about, transparency, something I'd love to see as well. Well, great. I really enjoyed that deeper dive into vendor management. Would you like to kind of tell us a little bit more about Whistic? And feel free to share the screen.
That sounds good. Let me jump in here. All right. It says, I think you need to stop sharing.
Of course. All righty. There we go.
Okay. So what I'd like to do briefly is just orient our audience on Whistic, and then I'll show some product demo pieces here. So when you think of the Whistic platform and vendor risk management, there's two sides. There's the enterprise or the buyer of the software or service, and you have the vendor who's the seller. And when you look at what Whistic does, on one side, we have an offering that allows enterprises to assess vendors from their security and compliance perspective. We call this vendor risk management. So on this side of the demo that I'm going to show, this is really about automating, providing insights, an easier, more streamlined interface. Quinn at Doctor on Demand talks about this automation and insight. So that's one side of what I'm going to show. On the other side of it, you have the seller. We have a product offering here that's built for enabling that transparency that we talked about, enabling sellers to proactively put their security and compliance information into the hands of those buyers before they get asked. And really what we're talking about here is compressing that sales cycle. Organizations like Gremlin going from an average of 45 to 60 days to less than 4 days to complete a security review with one of their enterprise customers. So I'll show you a little bit of that. The two sides come together in what we call the trust catalog. And so this really is kind of the meeting of both of those organizations. And organizations like Okta, speed is really important to them. So having vendors with already published profiles in the Whistic Trust Catalog helps speed up the process for both parties. So what I'd love to do is just sort of jump into a quick overview first of the vendor risk management side, and then we'll kind of talk to the profile side at the end here. So from a product perspective, Whistic is really based on standardized frameworks. So we support a lot of the industry standard frameworks that are used for these types of assessments from a vendor risk management perspective. A lot of organizations also have custom needs. And so we support the ability for them to leverage and build custom frameworks on the foundation of these standards. And when you think about the life cycle of vendor management or vendor risk management, it really starts with somebody wants to buy something. And so we have a process where you can customize, build, and publish the drag and drop interface, a vendor intake flow. Now, this could also be through an API integration. A lot of companies don't have a contract management system or a procurement system, so they use Whistic to kick off a purchase or a vendor assessment and capture things like what sort of systems or data will this vendor have access to. Those are some of the risk factors that we talked about. So kind of catching it at the front end, and we have the ability to automate pieces of that life cycle process. So for example, as those vendors get submitted through that intake form, based on the information that gets submitted, maybe I want to trigger a certain type of assessment, or maybe I need to loop in the legal team or the finance team. Maybe I'm going to flag them as high risk if they have a certain type of data. So we think about automating and defining workflow and notifications, which is some of those hallway conversations that you might have, or Slack message or an email that typically happen outside of the platform today. This information really plays into and flows into the vendor catalog. So I've got a centralized place where all of my vendor information is now flowing in. Maybe I've imported this in from a spreadsheet that I was using previously. I've got all of my information stored in a central repository, all of the documentation that I would need to satisfy audit and regulatory requirements, those types of things. And as I onboard new vendors, I have the ability to assess them based on their risk level. So we kind of talked about this concept of triaging the risk, and based on the types of information or how critical they are, I may need to engage them and request documentation or a framework questionnaire. One of the things that we offer from the Whistic platform is this example, this vendor already has a profile in the Whistic Trust Catalog. So instead of sending them a questionnaire, waiting 10 days for them to fill that out, I'm going to go to the Trust Catalog, and that button that I could have clicked that, I'll just show you here what it would look like here. I find them in the Trust Catalog, I can import them. So they've already got, Cloud Security Alliance CAIQ. That's one of the industry leading cloud security assessment frameworks. I'm going to leverage that first. I have some information already at my fingertips to perform that assessment. And depending on the type of company it is, they may have additional information. For example, Okta here has a number of different questionnaires. It's over 2,000 different questions answered. You're going to have everything you need at your fingertips on this type of an assessment here. So really, we try to think about how do we eliminate some of those manual bottlenecks and speed up the pace at which we can do these assessments.
So Nick, I have a question. How does that business data get into your trust library? Is it one of your customers builds a roster of vendors and then they can approve to have that in? There's a sharing, or can any company like a SaaS company input their information, and so it's now broadly used by your customers?
Both. So
it's both. So anybody can go in to the Whistic site and then register as a vendor to go into your trust system?
So there's a free offering. If you're invited into Whistic by one of our customers that's performing an assessment, the end of that assessment, you have the ability free of charge to publish your information to the Trust Catalog. The benefit to you there is clear. I don't want to have to go through that experience again, and I already have information in Whistic, right? And so from a Whistic perspective, we try to make that easy. One example would be if I already have answered questions. In this example, here's the CAIQ Lite. If I've already answered these questions, let's use what I've already got. So you see this button here, use existing answers. And there's mappings across these frameworks. They're not all discrete. So if I've answered Cloud Security Alliance CAIQ, I've actually got some of the same information that Shared Assessment SIG asks for. Yep. And so we make it easy to leverage that. That's kind of the backbone of the Trust Catalog. So on one side, it's the vendor publishing this information as a result of a response from a customer. We also pull some data from partners. So partnership with Cloud Security Alliance, we have information that organizations have published there. We pull security rating information. We pull some information from websites. So there's a number of different pieces that come into the Trust Catalog.
That is fantastic. Well, great.
So from a kind of process perspective, once I have the information on a vendor, I'm going to want to engage them. So now I'm diving into a vendor assessment here. I'm going to gather documentation. I've already got what systems they have access to at my company. Maybe they plug into G Suite. Maybe they are plugged into my Workday system, and this is the type of data they have access to. So now I'm going to perform an assessment on them, and whether that's data from the Trust Catalog or whether I've engaged with them directly, Whistic enables organizations to easily run through that end-to-end assessment process and automate and streamline things like, here's the answers to the questions they provided and here's the documentation. What do I think about that? Is that an issue to me? Is that remediated? Is that an item I need to follow up with the vendor on and communicate with them through the platform? So those are all pieces of the puzzle that Whistic handles from a life cycle perspective. The end of that, you spit out reporting, right? The insights and the risks that are flagged and the program level data is at your fingertips from a Whistic perspective. So all the way from that initial intake to the ongoing reassessment and automation of those pieces and the data in between is kind of how we handle the vendor risk management side of the platform. The other side of that coin, now just shifting gears, is I'm a vendor and I get these questions from my customers over and over again. What can Whistic do to help there? And we call that the security profile. So that's this piece of the Whistic platform. So some companies purchase both sides of Whistic because they need to assess their vendors and they're a vendor to their customers. Other organizations are focused on one or the other side. But essentially what we're doing here is proactively self-assessing my organization against these same frameworks that we just showed. So these are industry standard frameworks that my customers are going to pull questions from. Why don't I just go answer those in advance and not wait for that spreadsheet to come across? Most of those custom spreadsheets are cobbled together from those industry standards anyways.
Yeah.
And so just like we have a LinkedIn profile for our personal or professional life, my organization has one or more Whistic profiles regarding our security and compliance. So here's my audits and certifications, even my security team. Here's my information in a security white paper. Here's a copy of my SOC 2 Type 2 audit report.
And so all of that can just be sent to a prospective customer. Let's say I'm a vendor in your system and we get the questionnaire. We could say, hey, you know what? Let me send you a link to our Whistic profile first and have you review our information. Is that kind of a process you could use?
Exactly. What leading companies are doing is they're not waiting for their customer to send them a questionnaire. They're early on in the sales process, training their sales team to come in here, click share profile, or better yet, to do it from Salesforce. So I'm on a Salesforce opportunity and I'm in the sales team here. I'm selling to Mr. Test 44. I'm going to share my profile directly from our Salesforce application, which is what I'm showing you here.
So you have an API with Salesforce, and so the latest information will be right there in your CRM.
Exactly. And even more transparent, this example was from Atlassian. So on their trust page, they have links to their Whistic profiles. So even more transparent earlier on in the sales process. So they've got separate profiles built for each of their product offerings here. And this is more of a self-serve. So we try to enable our customers to handle that in a few different ways, whether it's a one-on-one communication, whether it's from Salesforce, or whether it's a self-serve in this example. And really that transparency and that more proactive approach is what we're getting at here. That security, compliance, privacy information into the hands of your customers, reducing that friction. And just coming full circle there, really the kind of the nuts and bolts of this, just to summarize, would be speed. That's one of the themes that we hear over and over again. I'm just buried in spreadsheets. I've got a backlog. I'm slowing down the business. Automation, and I don't have insights. If I don't have a central place, I don't have insights. And then reducing that friction and speeding up sales cycles, improving that security review process are a few of the themes. So that's a quick overview of the different pieces that go into the Whistic platform on both the vendor risk management side and the profile side.
I love the clean UI, really easy to navigate. And so people with different levels of security experience can log in and pretty much find what they need. One question I have, what is your licensing model? You don't have to say prices, but just sort of how do you license the platform to the different sort of audiences?
Yeah, so very similar to many SaaS offerings, we have a bundle of features and functionality in different packages. So standard, professional, enterprise, for example, on both sides of the platform. So on the vendor risk management side of things, maybe you're just barely getting started and you only have 100 vendors to assess and you have very light needs. Or maybe you're a large enterprise and you're assessing hundreds or thousands of vendors and you need API integration, you need full access to Trust Catalog, you need to bring in security ratings information. So we have different packages of feature functionality based on the scope of your assessment needs on that side. On the profile side of Whistic, similar thing. you just need one profile, or do you need 7 different profiles for each of your products? Do you want to layer in an NDA workflow? Do you want to have the Salesforce integration? Do you need 200 users or just 10 users? So that's kind of the way that we bundle the packages on both sides.
And you work with SMBs, mid-market, global companies, kind of across the board, because all those organizations need vendor risk management.
Yep. Yeah, on our screen here, we sort of have representation from a larger enterprise, a mid-market enterprise, and a fast-growing startup here. So yeah, across all industries and different sizes of companies as well.
Well, fantastic. Well, I'd like to show everybody where to find you on CyberExchange. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we will explore that together. So let me just pull up my browser. And so if you go to CyberExchange, which has launched as a framework-based, very, very intelligent cybersecurity marketplace, very proud that Whistic is one of our charter members. And I would come over here and just find Whistic as a provider. I could type in, risk management or vendor management, and Whistic pops up. And this is kind of showing the areas that Whistic can impact an organization kind of across the way. And we'll click on the tile, and here we have some other great summaries that Nick spoke about already around the product specifications. There's a video that you can watch for some customers on the platform. They can save it, but you can also just get a quote right here from the platform and go right to one of Nick's team members to take care of you, and see how they can help you solve this really, really big pain point that really every company has around vendor risk management. So it's readily available at CyberExchange. And I just want to say thank you to Nick for joining us. I always learn a lot in these sessions, and I know our audience will too. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Well, thanks everybody. And thanks to you guys for joining, and we'll see you on the next Innovator Spotlight. Take care.